all black everything, all black, you know, all black in the name of all my black heroes, all black everything, all black polos, all black medallions, yeah, all black.
Thank you all for coming. It is an honor and privilege to host Dr. Mark Anthony Neal here at the City College of New York. We are in the Rifkin Center for Humanities. I want to thank the Department of English, Barbara Rifkins and her family for being in this space. I want to thank the Provost's office, the President's office, the Division of Humanities and the Arts, the Black Studies program, for hosting us this morning. So, Mark Anthony Neal is, I have your voice in my head, sir. I really do. I was writing notes and I was like, I'm going to ask this question in this way. Mark Anthony Neal is the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African and African American Studies and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Duke University, where he offers courses on Black masculinity, popular culture, and digital humanities, including signature courses on Michael Jackson and the Black performance tradition and the history of hip hop, which he teaches with Grammy Award-winning producer Ninth Wonder. Do you still do that?
I do not.
I figured, right?
I've aged out.
Well, and he's still in the area, though, right?
Yeah. So he's still doing it, yes.
Yeah. He is the author of several books, including What the Music Said, Black Popular Music and Black Public Culture, 1999, Soul Babies, Black Popular Culture and the Post-Soul Aesthetic, 2002, and Looking for Leroy, Illegible Black Masculinities, 2013. The 10th anniversary edition of Neal's New Black Man was published in February of 2015 by Routledge. He is the co-editor of That's the Joint, the Hip Hop Studies Reader, now in its second edition, and additionally, Neal is the host of the very famous and critical video webcast Left of Black, which is produced in collaboration with the Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke, and now in its 13th season? Congratulations. You can follow him on Twitter at New Black Man and IG at Booker BB Brown. Welcome, Dr. Mark Anthony Neal.
Thank you for having me.
Man, I feel like I am like impersonating you. Quite frankly, I'm gonna channel you at this moment. So, Black Ephemera, The Crisis and Challenge of the Musical Archive, a book written maybe not primarily in the pandemic, but certainly finished, it seemed like.
Definitely finished in the pandemic.
So how did we get here? We went from Looking for Leroy was this year marks a decade from that. So
it was a journey, in the sense that I knew I wanted to do something with this digital moment, but the real impetus for the book actually was the presentation I did at the College Arts Association yesterday, which is not in the book. My favorite hip hop song is Pete Rock and CL Smooth's They Reminisce Over You. Ninth Wonder and I became friends and then eventually teaching partners because of our love of the song. That was our initial connection. You like that song too? And then we just kind of went from there.
I reminisce for a spell, or shall I say think back 22 years ago to keep it on track. The birth of a child on the 8th of October. A toast when my granddaddy came sober.
The song, which is about the death of a guy by the name of Trouble T. Roy, who was a dancer in Heavy D and the Boys, he was one of the boys. And the song has this really beautiful horn here.
Mm-hmm. My God.
As much as I love hip hop and consider myself a hip hop head, I've always been more interested in the music of hip hop than the lyrics of hip hop. Mm-hmm. That those people all, for me, hip hop has always been a sonic experience. And I spent years trying to figure out that sample, right? That was before you could pull up little things on your phone and figure out what you were hearing. I knew it was a horn that was electrified. So I was like, okay, it got to be Eddie Harris. And fortunately, I did radio when I was working on my PhD, right? So I liberated.
Is that what it's called?
Hundreds of records from the catalog, many of which hadn't been played before I got there and would not have been played after I left, right? So I felt good about what was a reclamation project.
There we go.
I went through all these Eddie Harris albums. No, that's not it. Went through all these Rashawn Roland Kirk albums, right? Because again, same kind of period and era, that same sound. Didn't find anything. And then I accidentally came upon this Tom Scott song. And it was Tom Scott, the song's called Today. And it was his cover of the Jefferson Airplane. It's an actual Jefferson Airplane.
I'm so full of love.
Long story short, I'm watching the Boondocks circa 2004 to 2005. It's the first season. There's an episode called Riley Was Here. And Riley's the younger son, right? The one that's kind of off the hook. And he's doing all this graffiti art around their middle class suburb of Chicago, right? And grandfather gets upset, puts him in art class with this cartoon version of Bob Ross.
Let's have some mountains and some clouds. Oh, and of course, some joyful little trees. Right there.
And finally, he does this elaborate picture of his dead parents on his grandfather's house. Cops are coming, they're running away from the cops. And then all of a sudden I hear this Tom Scott sample.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, Riley. I had a great time painting with you.
And for folks who know the archive,
Right.
immediately you make the connection that this is a reference to They Reminisce Over You.
Right.
And that's when I was like, wow, I need to do something about the way that black art, blackness, animates the archive, right? And I just sat with that. I didn't know what I was going to do. I never wrote it out as an article. And it wasn't until I got deep into the project that I realized the project that I was working on was one about thinking about how blackness archives itself. It started in this kind of digital humanities moment with all the hashtags, Black Lives Matter. I thought I was writing a book about what folks were doing digitally at that moment. And as I talk about in the introduction, I literally apprenticed for 3 or 4 years with the mind of Jessica Marie Johnson to figure out the stuff that I couldn't figure out. And what I figured out at the end of that was that, no, what I'm doing here is talking about the translation from analog blackness to digital blackness and what gets lost in that process, what gets gained in that process, who's in the best position to curate that. And ultimately, the end game, I think, for the book, for me, is a real concern about the state of black cultural criticism amongst folks who don't necessarily know the archive or care about the archive, and the fact that there are not enough caretakers of the archive at this point in time.
So first, I'd like to say that this is the second time in 2 weeks that Jessica Marie Johnson's name has been brought up here on the City College campus.
As it should.
Last week we hosted Lynn Nottage for the Langston Hughes Festival, and Caitlin Greenwich, who writes is the features editor for Harper's Bazaar, shouted out Jessica Marie Johnson, quoted her extensively in our symposium, and Jessica's my girl, so I was like,
and
hey.
you know that's the context in which we first met.
So, yes.
You had come down to UNC.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's when we first met.
Yes, and so and I remember talking to her. That was probably at the beginning of your apprenticeship, because I remember you two being together and being like, that's cool. But that was a great conference we were at.
And I presented at that conference what's chapter 1 of Black Ephemera, an early portion of the status chapter.
Well, and I will say, this is a great tie-in, because during that presentation, it was one where many of us in the audience just sat back, because your mind is such where like the references are coming at, and I think that we are incredibly fortunate to have streaming devices on our phones as we read, and that's a later question about how you envision someone taking in this information. So I'll circle back to that. You just said that there aren't enough caretakers of the archive. You also name check Henry Louis Gates in this book as someone who has, at least at this moment, is recognized as a curator
Yeah.
of Black history, of Black experience. So can you tell me a little bit more about, again, there seems to be a great deal of permeability, right, with Black culture at this moment. So talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, you know, it's taken me a long time, years really, to appreciate Skip's practice. Skip figured out how to build relationships with institutions in the development sphere, with places like the National Humanities Institute and things like that. To do upon what he's essentially done over the last 30 years is try to find a way to archive different aspects of the Black experience. You know, folks have been critical of some of it, right? It all doesn't always work. But whether it's the DNA Project or the work that he did very early on with the Africana Encyclopedia, which then became Africana.com, that's been his thing. And he realized, I think, very early on that part of this question was one about where do you find the resources to store Blackness? And while we know so many Black institutions are challenged with physical storage, where you keep actual archives and the cost that's associated with that, there's also a cost, and you wouldn't necessarily think so, of maintaining this stuff in a digital realm. You know, the crisis of Black folks in the digital moment is not content, right? It's not even access. It's, you know, how do you maintain this, right? You know, Black folks are great at apps. We dominate applications, we dominate content. What we don't have are servers. Right, and servers, you know, the capacity to hold on to the things is much more of a challenge. And Skip was thinking about this in an analog moment, right? But it's relevant to the moment that we're in now.
Yeah, it speaks though to what you're saying. I think about, there seems to have been a loss of communal practices, right? The idea that we're coming to be, that we can name him as a singular person, as a singular force. And then we think about, well, who else is doing that work? And I think that becomes a question of access, but also just who, I mean, I don't know what else is involved in it. So,
you know, Blackness, I mean, Blackness is, you know, we go back to the antebellum period, right? We know Blackness makes money, right? You know, when Blackness was a physical labor, right? Black bodies laboring. There's always been this relationship between Black bodies, Blackness, extraction, whether it was physical labor, that extraction in this moment, right? Particularly when we see this kind of crisis of work and labor, the extraction is primarily cultural, right? What are we extracting from Blackness, right, into the cultural realm? You know, global corporations that allow them to generate money. And I think in that environment where a Black writer, whether it's an author or a journalist, you know, at a major corporation, can make a quality of living off of Blackness that previous generations weren't able to do. And I think in that context, it becomes real easy to not think about a communal project as much as it is an individual, right? Everyone is trying to be put on in their particular moment. And because of the nature of how we talk about Blackness, you know, it aligns with celebrity culture. Right. So we're not talking about deep archival content at this moment, right? We're talking about what the happening is now. I did a piece, and it's funny, it was brought up, the panel I did at CAA, College Arts Association, was sponsored by a journal called Liquid Blackness. A group of folks, Alessandra Riango, you know, among them, who about a decade ago began to think about Blackness as literally being liquid, right? If you can imagine Blackness being the thing that you can pour into different, and to take the shape of those different spaces, that's part of what they were thinking about. And Alessandra first connected with my work when I gave a talk at CUNY, the graduate conference back in 2008. And I talked about that, and that was just a stream of consciousness, even being a little pissed off at the moment. But the pressure on cultural critics at the time was to hurry up and think, right? And I like my cultural criticism, and this is going to be the title of a book of essays one of these days. I liked my cultural criticism slow cooked,
Right.
right? Because that's the way I was introduced to it.
Right.
Right. That's how Baraka introduced me to that work. That's how Ellison introduced me to that work. That's how back in the day when the Village Voice was popping.
Right.
That's where Lisa Jones and Joe Morgan and of course the great Greg Tate. That's where I learned the process. Nelson George and Billboard, right? It's a slow cooked process.
Yeah.
Now an album hits the streaming at 12:01, and there are 700 think pieces.
Right. 9 a.m.
Even before then,
Right,
right?
right.
Because every one of these spots are in competition,
Right.
right? To have the first piece out there, and you read the stuff, and it is literally ephemera.
Right.
It's stuff that won't matter.
Right.
And for me, cultural criticism is a timeless act, right? You are not only trying to match the creativity of the art
Yeah.
that you're talking about, but the criticism itself has to be an act
Yes.
of art and something that people can go back to
Right.
years later, right? The fact that I can go back and read Baraka or Ralph Ellison writing about Baraka,
Right. Right.
now 60 years later,
Right.
and still get something important out of that interaction. Those are my biggest concerns at this point in time, right? And when you do stuff slow cooked, it means you're reading other people.
Right.
You recognize the critical generosity of when folks make great points.
Right.
Like, did you acknowledge those points because it doesn't take anything away from your own brilliance and genius?
Right.
We've gotten away from that, right? When I read Greg Tate was an archive,
Yes.
right? If I have any archival practice, it was learned by reading Greg Tate, where I could read a Greg Tate article, right? And I always loved the fact Tate would be writing about an album or film, but not. Right. That was an excuse to do other kinds of labor.
Right.
And very often it was also an excuse to bring all of these other voices into it that normally folks wouldn't have been able to engage with.
Right.
And I think we've lost that part of cultural criticism. And it's not even just that individual writers don't have the sensibilities of it. And you see this a lot in terms of trade books. Editors aren't interested in that, right? Because the editors are invested in the singular voice of the author,
Right.
right? Whether it's an article or whether or not it's a trade book, right? They don't want footnotes,
Right. Right.
right?
Yeah. No. Again, for me, the resonance is a loss of community in some, even a professional community,
Yes,
right? Because
yes.
you widely acknowledge that one of your bestest friends in the world is Joan Morgan, who also emerged from that moment,
Yeah.
right? And the fact that you can just list off people, and then we fast forward and we go, well, who's doing that kind of work? And also the loss of venues, right? You mentioned the Village Voice. Like, what are the outlets now?
And that's the irony, right? Anyone can write an article and post it
Right.
on the internet now, right? There is, in theory, some democratization
Right.
of thought and idea that exists, but there's so much of it,
Right.
and it's not curated,
Right.
and it's not well vetted. Some of the experiences I've had writing for some of the major outlets, and I don't do it a lot, working with editors who are half my age, who have no idea what I'm talking about, right? Who don't get the reference, don't understand why I might include, my favorite piece these days. I was fortunate to do a piece for the New York Times on Patti LaBelle. It was a wonderful experience, and I got to go to her house, got to spend 3 or 4 hours with her. They did a whole photo shoot with it that was shot by Deb Willis and her son Hank Willis Thomas, right? So it felt really communal in that moment. But I remember going through the editing process, and I was happy with the piece, but the kinds of things that were taken out
Right.
were gestures to this wider world that produced Patti LaBelle.
Right. Right.
Right, that in the mainstream there's just no interest,
Right.
right, in that ephemera, right?
And it's interesting, though, because it's chicken and egg, right? Because you do talk about her, you situate her here, in being in conversation, and then going back to when she was part of the Bluebells and songs that they sang and riffing off of and covering,
Right.
And so, you know, again, we get a glimpse of how your mind works, right? Those kinds of connections. It's interesting. Last week, I believe, last New York Times Magazine, the cover of that magazine was SZA, and Danielle Smith wrote that.
Right.
And again, when we think about really serious cultural critics, particularly music critics at this moment with regards to black music, she just, of course, published her book last year, Shine Brightly, which was one of the books that I thought was be interesting to be in conversation with this one.
Yeah, we're trying to schedule our Left to Black with Danielle as it is now. I've known Danielle about 15 years.
Yeah.
I'm happy that folks are getting to appreciate her genius and the way that she connects with music. I mean, just as brilliant, you know, to talk about this kind of different moment that we're in, just as brilliant as the book was the 2 seasons of the podcast.
Right.
That she did to go along with it, right? So the stuff that you couldn't contain in the book could spill out, right? Could be pouring out into the podcast.
Right, and again, that podcast is available on streaming services, and every single episode is dedicated to a specific artist and to why that artist is under recognized, not celebrated enough, and anyone from Mariah Carey, Beyonce, even
Karen White. Right.
I mean, but that's the thing, right? So even like names that people go, but they've won awards, and her argument is still black women in particular continue to be overlooked.
Patti LaBelle and LaBelle are not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
That's right.
Patti LaBelle has never received the Kennedy honors, as one example of that, right? And if you go through and just look at who's gotten Kennedy's Center honors, right? I mean, there aren't many black women, right? At least in the contemporary moment,
Right. Thank you for that. I'm sorry, I'm that's going through my body. But it does remind me that this year's Kennedy Center honors, I remember she came out and there was the question of like, why doesn't she have, like, surely she's been...
She was singing for Gladys Knight, right? And there's a way in which you're like, how is Gladys Knight just getting a Kennedy Center honors in 2022?
Right. And being feted by Patti LaBelle that doesn't have one.
Who doesn't have one, right.
Okay, I'll breathe through it. So I had written notes per chapter on this. I wanted to call your attention, so a couple of things, because again, your mind is
And by the way, you need a podcast, because you're good at this.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Provost, it's going to be part of my portfolio as well. Thank you for that. I want to call attention to the 2 chapters that you have, one about New Orleans, Katrina, the cultural production that came out of that moment, and also how black folks are dealing with the visibility of Black death, right? So these are like the 2 middle chapters in this book. Talk to me a little bit about, again, just how you are navigating all of that and how folks are reaching to the archive in those moments, in the different archives. You know, throughout this, your template or your default setting is always music, right? But you're talking about books, you're talking about a novel, you're talking about a documentary. So
the chapter in what becomes a conversation about New Orleans, Ricardo Cortez Cruz, we were part of a collection that was edited by Jabari Assim. Came out 2000, 2001, called Not Guilty. And it was 12 black men writing about the judicial system, law enforcement. Jabari, who is the hardest working, I got to give him a shout out. He is the hardest working man in the industry. At the time that he edited the book, he was the books editor for the Washington Post Book World. Okay. And he discovered me. That's the thing I love about it. He had found out that what the music said was coming out. No one knew who I was. It was going to be my first book. He's like, this looks like an interesting book. Can you review Nelson George's Hip Hop America?
Wow.
And that's what he did.
Wow.
He would find up and coming writers who had books coming out. The best platform to introduce new writers is for you to do a high profile book review.
Right.
And so 2 years later, he puts it together. And there was something about Ricardo Cortez Cruz's writing. It was like, just, and so then I found out that he had these novels, these 2 weird ass experimental novels. Straight Outta Compton, which I still can't process, and 5 Days of Bleeding. And I remember trying 20 years ago to teach both of them, right, and struggled, right, because I couldn't quite put my hand on what it was that he was doing. What he was doing was hypertext.
Right.
In this moment before we understood, and everybody knows what hypertext is because you do it all the time, but you don't know that's what it is, right? Your ability to click on a link, that's what hypertext is. So he was doing an analog version of hypertext because the main character, this black woman named Zuzu, spoke in song lyrics. Primarily blues women from the 20s and the 30s. Obscure lyrics from Sarita Wright. Right. It just, and it's like you didn't get the novel if you didn't know what was behind the references.
Right.
And it took me 20 years, right, you know, to be doing this kind of digital stuff. Like, oh. And then I was like, no, but I need to center it in this woman.
Yeah.
Who's experiencing all levels of trauma throughout this 125-page book.
Yeah.
And that was the opening point. And you know, there was a film that was done about a black couple narrated by a black woman who left New Orleans during Katrina. It was a homemade video, right? She just knew that she needed to document what was happening. And she was like an audio-visual version of Zuzu. Because she would just drop these references. Like there was one line in the film where she's going, I'm like Patti LaBelle on my own.
Right.
Like, whoa, right? Or they had a dog that was named Kizzy. Right? It's like, oh, damn, right? The roots. So it's like, so she was dropping all these little jewels, and I finally figured out a way. That was the most difficult chapter for me. Because I had to learn the Black Women's Blues archive. You know, we all know Mamie and Bessie Smith, but it's so much larger than that. And one of the figures that I found in there was Victoria Spivey, who had done this song called Black Snake Moan or Black Moan, that was then jacked by a male blues artist, right, who became more famous with it. And so she narrates in an article in 1963 about how he had taken her song. And then she reminded him of that, and he was like, but you know, I asked you about it. I asked you, right, if I could do this little thing with this song. And while the songs are two very different, right, there was still something unique that she brought to the table. Right. Victoria Spivey, who started her own label. In the 1960s, recording the generation of blues artists who came before her. She's been lost in the archive, right? So that really is a chapter, right? As I'm talking about Black women's trauma, and I get to bring in the work of Carrie Mae Weems and so many of these other folks, it really is about what is lost in the archive that we don't understand. The third chapter was really the chapter that I thought was the book that I was writing. It's about what was happening in this digital moment. We forget about, you know, we've been reminding of it the last couple of years because of the anniversaries, but that Rodney King moment that changed everything. Right, you know, and it built the foundations for the digital archive that we have now. And we talk all the time about Rodney King. We don't talk enough about LaTosha Harlins. Right, and the rage that exploded in 1992 was as much about the acquittal of those 4 officers as it was the acquittal of the Korean woman who killed LaTosha Harlins, right? Who was also acquitted. She was actually convicted, and the judge said, she doesn't look like a criminal. She does not look like someone who's a criminal, where the premise of Harlins being shot in the first place was the shooter's son or grandson or nephew saying, she looks like she's a gangbanger.
And setting that context of Los Angeles, Korean American and Korean immigrant tensions in African American neighborhoods.
Absolutely.
And then that, who looks like, who is criminalized, who isn't.
So we have this practice of digital mourning in this moment. I was like, let's go back, Let's think about the ways that the culture has mourned signature moments.
Right.
Right. So to go back and look at the Martin Luther King moment,
Yeah.
and not just the obvious stuff. Nina Simone's "Why the King of Love is Dead."
Yeah.
Right, which I first experienced as an undergraduate in the film From Montgomery to Memphis. Right, Montgomery to Birmingham. I can't remember the name of the which was a documentary of those last days of King, and hearing Nina Simone's voice and going, "What the hell is this?"
Right.
Right, I've never heard anything like this before. But also Max Roach.
Yeah.
Right, who does a gospel album with the J.C. White singers.
Yeah.
Were you there when they crucified my Lord? 2 years later, so there's all this stuff in the culture, and then let's take it back, and the stuff that's buried in the archive, like the Supremes.
Right.
The signature group from Motown. How many people knew that they recorded a tribute album to Sam Cooke?
Right. Right.
Right. It's not very good. I'm just going to be honest about that. And you wonder in Berry Gordy's mind, well, I know why he did what he did. It seems like Marvin Gaye would have been the better choice
Right.
to do a tribute album. Marvin Gaye did a tribute album to Nat King Cole.
Right.
Right. And the Supremes piece was about Sam Cooke had provided a space for black culture in the mainstream.
Right.
The albums at the Copacabana and stuff like that Berry Gordy saw as a path for the Supremes. But then you find out that Sam Cooke, right, and I didn't know anything about this album until I started working on the book, did a tribute album to Billie Holiday.
Right.
Right, which is also not very good.
Right.
Right, but he understood that given who he was,
Right.
he had a responsibility to pay tribute to who Billie Holiday was and to introduce her music to an audience that would not be familiar with it, because at that time, Sam Cooke was a legitimate pop star.
Right. Right. Your conversation about pop music and the American Songbook was fascinating to me because most of the American Songbook, or a good chunk of it, is written by Jewish American children of immigrants, right?
As was Strange Fruit, right? The song that made Billie Holiday a political figure.
And so what's interesting to me is going off of that, so you have peoples who are coming from groups that are othered, right? Immigrant groups, children of immigrants, African American, all underrepresented, who are staking a claim in this idea of America, and via a sonic highway, right? And so you write about in that chapter, you're writing about Marvin Gaye and contrasting his attempts at making a play in that, and then Aretha Franklin. Talk a little bit about that.
Popular music was the post-World War II immigrant hustle. Mm-hmm. All of the great black music that we think of being produced post-World War II up into the 1960s, right? Berry Gordy really is the shift that occurs. Came from these record companies.
Right.
That were founded and created by European immigrants. Mm-hmm. So whether we're talking about the Ertegun brothers and Jerry Wexler at Atlanta, Atlantic, when you talk about the Chess brothers who are coming from Poland, right, and what they do for American blues music,
right,
particularly the urban blues in the 1950s. And so you have these Tin Pan Alley writers, right, who are writing these songs that we now recognize as American Songbook. American standards, right?
Right.
We know them, when we hear them. The late Burt Bacharach,
yes,
right, is a later generation of this phenomenon. And when I was in college, I was a freshman in college when Marvin Gaye was shot by his father, August 1st, 1984. And I had been going through this whole Marvin Gaye process 2 years earlier. His music was in the house. I knew his music, but then he made this comeback, with Sexual Healing, and I got into this Marvin Gaye bag. And my mother bought me this Motown anthology, 3 albums, Marvin Gaye music. At this time when Motown 25, so they're reintroducing their catalog to folks. And I went through all those songs, and Stubborn Kind of Fella was like my soundtrack. So I was in this Marvin Gaye bag, and then he died, and it forced me to go deep into the archive. And 2 albums came out. In Dream of a Lifetime was the first album released after his death, right? Stuff that had been kind of lost in the archive. And there was a couple of these kind of show tunes. I was like, what is this? And then Columbia in '85 released an album called Romantically Yours. And it's a collection of Marvin Gaye singing these torch songs. And I remember how grown I felt making a mixtape for my girlfriend at the time, right? And we're studying late in the lobby of the dorm, got the boombox, and we sitting here listening to Marvin Gaye sing "Fly Me to the Moon." And so I was just always fascinated with those songs. And as I did a little bit more reading when David Ritz's, biography comes out, and then I realized that, Marvin Gaye wanted to be Frank Sinatra.
Right.
He wanted to record his version of In the Wee Small Hours of the Morning.
Right.
Right. And his first album from Motown is actually a collection of these songs. Right. He sings Witchcraft and all this. And Berry Gordy's like, okay, that's nice.
Right.
I'll give you a pass because you're my son, my brother-in-law.
Right.
But we need some hits. And he goes into this whole other kind of bag.
Right.
And then they're on tour. Motown's on tour, and Marvin didn't go on the tour. So he's left home to his own devices. And he hires Bobby Scott, right? The great, songwriter and arranger. Bobby Scott takes 7 of these songs and creates musical charts for them. And Marvin Gaye does recordings of them in 64, 65, and 66. Motown never releases them. All right. He, over the period from 65 until his death, continues to rework these songs, right, with the original charts. The technology changes in the early 1970s. So what was initially 8-track studios and 16-track studios becomes 24 and 72. You hear the change in Gaye's music when you listen to What's Going On and Let's Get It On, right? Stanley Crouch talks about this in his obituary for Gaye, that you get these Marvin Gaye choirs, right? If you listen to those songs closely, he came from a doo-wop tradition, right? A gospel. So he creates these Marvin Gaye choirs where he's layering different aspects of his voice on top of each other. Plays with it on What's Going On. It is pristine.
Yeah.
And Let's Get It On, right? There's some moments in the title track and Let's Get It On where you're hearing 3 or 4 Marvin Gayes layered on top of each other. So he starts to do this with these Bobby Scott songs. And eventually Motown releases it as an album. What is it called? I can't remember.
Wasn't it Vulnerable?
Vulnerable, right. And it's 7 songs and then 3 other versions of the same songs. And I always wanted to write about those songs. And didn't know how. I'm not an ethnomusicologist, right? I don't know music that way. I needed to find a language to talk about those songs, and the way that I went into it is this idea of black male interiority, right? And the thing that kicked it off for me was Drake.
Right.
Drake does a song in 2011 called Marvin's Room. And it's just an odd title on so many different levels. And it's a song, right? Say what you want about Drake, and particularly early Drake.
Right.
Early Drake is all about interiority.
Yes.
All of his songs is, I loved you, you broke up with me, why can't we be friends?
Right.
Every one of those songs, right? And some of it is mean-spirited, some of it is not, right? But that's what motivates him. And it was a unique sense of vulnerability in hip-hop, right? That's also matched by what he brought to the table sonically.
Yes.
Right? Because he was not that kind of, he's not Busta Rhymes.
Right.
He's not Jay-Z. There's something, a different kind of affect, right, in his performance. Like, so why is he doing this song Marvin's Room, right? He recorded it in a studio that's now known as Marvin's Room. Marvin Gaye built his own studio in the mid-1970s, right? And as David Ritz talked about, and his ex-wife, Nona Gaye, talked about, full studio, he had a bedroom, he had a bathroom, he would live in the studio, and that's where he played with all of these songs, right? So it was literally a space of interiority for him that then, once the tax man came, IRS came, he had to sell the studio. Studio continued to work, right? Luther Vandross recorded in Marvin's Room. Mariah Carey recorded in Marvin's Room. Like all these great acts went through Marvin's Room at some point.
Right.
And this is Drake in 2011. That's why he called the song what he called it. And Drake was aware enough of who Marvin Gaye was
Right.
and the work that Marvin Gaye did in that it was a natural nod,
Right.
gesture to that. And then the Aretha Franklin piece. I love Aretha Franklin. My mother's favorite artist. She had two favorite artists, Aretha Franklin and Shirley Caesar. I want to get around to writing about Shirley Caesar, right? Particularly, she lives in Raleigh, very visible in the area. So I'm hoping one day to be able to sit down and do an interview with her to talk about her and my mother. But a lot of Aretha Franklin, the Atlantic catalog. As I open the book and talk about who I've become as a critic, as a writer, was not an accident. Right? My parents, when I was 5 years old, in the span of 9 months, my father took me to see the Supremes at the Apollo, March of '71, without Diana Ross. In October '71, again, I'm still 5 years old, my mother took me to see the Jackson 5 at Madison Square Garden. And then in June of '71, right, Aretha came to the Apollo for a week, right? A rare occasion where the New York Times covered black music, right? They actually interviewed her at the Apollo, right? Because she had been there. It was like a homecoming for Aretha. On a Sunday afternoon, my parents both took me to see Aretha Franklin. Her music director was King Curtis, right? Who was actually murdered in front of his apartment in August of 1971 on my mother's birthday. But what she did, Aretha did at the Apollo, was part of the national tour that they were on, was captured at Fillmore West, right? Which I would argue, there's no Amazing Grace album without Fillmore West,
Right.
right? And I would argue that Fillmore West is a great album for a bunch of reasons, right? Including the third night. And again, I'm 5 or 6 years old when the album comes out. And I've already heard the set, right? Because it's what they performed at the Apollo by the time the album comes out. But of course, when she's at the Apollo, the third night at the Fillmore is in there where Ray Charles just appears. Right? And again, you got to put that Fillmore West album in some sort of context. King Curtis is directing the band. Billy Preston, right, is playing organ. He has the best quote from those 3 nights. You know, they asked him, what was it like playing for Aretha in front of all these hippies at the Fillmore West? And he goes, the hippies flipped the fuck out. that was it in a nutshell.
Right.
And she was genius in that space because not only did she introduce that audience to the Black Sanctified Church,
Yes.
which is what she would also do a year later with Amazing Grace with James Cleveland, she also gestured to their catalog.
Right.
So she covers Bread's Make It With You, right? She does Stephen Stills' Love the One You With, right? And around the same time, the Isley Brothers do it, right?
Right.
I would argue that and I love the Isley Brothers version, right? I heard both of those before I ever heard Stephen Stills.
Right. Right.
As some example of how these things kind of travel. It's extraordinary. She does Let It Be, a live version of it, before the Beatles had released it as a single. And because Billy Preston was in her band, and there's a book that I'm going to write after I get done with the book that I'm writing now on these black male soul singers who were not Marvin Gaye, Al Green,
Right.
and the famous ones. And so I really want to write and going to write about Billy Preston,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Who gets his start working in church choirs with James Cleveland, and then spend some time with Ray Charles,
Right.
and then spend some time with the Beatles.
Right. Right.
And his first 2 albums are actually released on Apple,
Right.
The Beatles label. But Billy Preston had slid a copy of that unreleased last Beatles album to Aretha Franklin, right? So she heard the song, right? And decided to perform it live before most folks would ever hear it as a single.
Right.
She does the same thing with Reach Out and Touch, right? Which we now think of as Diana Ross's song,
Right.
right? But her other Detroit homie, Aretha Franklin, also. So it's an extraordinary kind of moment. And so I wanted to talk about Aretha Franklin as an archival figure for what she did on that album, and obviously what she does with Amazing Grace, the coming together when she does that mashup on Amazing Grace, Precious Lord and You Got a Friend, which marries Thomas Dorsey
Right.
with Carole King,
Right.
Carole King, who provided her with her first major crossover hit
Right.
with Natural Woman. But there was this other part of Aretha. It was the stuff that she did from Columbia, from 60 when she signed until she leaves to go to Atlantic in the fall of 66. And I didn't get introduced to that music to around 1995 when I was doing radio, right? Columbia had put out like a 2 CD collection. And then eventually they released all of those albums in a box set. And it's extraordinary, right? You don't fully understand Aretha Franklin's genius until you delve into that Columbia catalog. Because she's singing everything, right? She is singing the American Songbook. She's singing Bobby Scott.
Right.
I would argue that Marvin Gaye's interest in Bobby Scott came from Aretha Franklin's recordings
Right. Right.
of his charts. She sings, right, and this is really the lesson of the music industry at the time. Both she and Barbra Streisand are signed to Columbia at the same time.
Right.
Barbra Streisand's breakthrough song is People.
Right.
Aretha Franklin does a version of People in the 1960s that remains in the can for 30 years. Because someone made a choice at Columbia at the time
Right.
that we're going to market Barbra Streisand, push her, right? And as Aretha said herself, what she did at Columbia, the way they marketed her is that she did all these turntable hits. The kind of songs that black people would listen to at parties, at
Right.
house parties, right? That's all they saw in her, even though she's singing such an expansive range.
People who need people. Are the luckiest people in the world.
So it was, to delve into that catalog and see what she does, and what you learn is that Aretha Franklin could sing whatever she wanted,
Right.
and everything that she sang transformed
Yeah.
the culture. My favorite moment is she covers a Hank Williams song
Yeah.
that was also covered by Dinah Washington. Dinah Washington's cover is very different than Hank Williams, right? As is Aretha's version of the song. And in that, you hear the future of black music.
Yes.
Right? The Aretha that emerges in '67, you hear on this Hank Williams cover. The album, and it's on an album where she covers Dinah Washington.
Right.
Because again, this is someone who was produced in a context that we'll never ever see again.
Right.
Her father is one of the greatest preachers in American society.
Right.
She learned performativity and gestures, right, from her dad.
Right.
Because her dad is both, quote unquote, a hoe,
Quote unquote.
right, and very famous, right? Everybody's coming through the house, right?
Right.
So on the one hand, she gets introduced to folks like Mahalia Jackson
Right.
and Dinah Washington as a child, right? In fact, her first husband, Ted White,
Right.
was Dinah Washington's ex-husband, to talk about how crazy and circular all of this is. Her Clara Ward who is her primary influence, right, was her father's unofficial partner
Right. Right.
for 20 years.
Right.
And so, and again, you know, when he's 18, 19, 20 years old, James Cleveland is living in the house,
Right.
right, and directing Reverend Franklin's choir.
Right.
Right? She meets Sam Cooke when she's 17 years old.
Right.
Right? I mean, so she couldn't help be what she was, right? And she never saw a song that she couldn't sing.
Right.
Dionne Warwick, and I'm glad she's getting her flowers now, because Dionne Warwick was such a critically important black woman singer, right? She was the one who really crossed over.
Right.
And she killed those Bacharach and David. So I don't want to take anything away from Al David and Burt Bacharach, because they did some great work without Dionne, but I would argue that Dionne made them.
Absolutely,
Right.
yes.
The songs that we know of them, we know because of Dionne Warwick. And I Say a Little Prayer is one of her classics.
Yes.
Aretha, when she does her version
Right.
of I Say a Little Prayer, with Dionne's cousin,
Right.
Sissy,
Right.
and the rest of those folks, and what was a playful whim,
Right.
they were just sitting around doodling,
Right.
and someone was like, run the tape.
Right. Absolutely. Right. Yeah.
And Dionne's version still stands,
Yeah.
but what Aretha does with that is a totally different song, right? And that's what she does to the archive,
Yeah.
right? She gets hold of stuff in the archives and radically transforms it.
Well, and I would say even things that hadn't yet made the archive. I mean, when she died, we heard all of these covers, including Adele's "Rolling in the Deep."
Rolling in the Deep, right.
And then you hear Aretha Franklin sing it, and you're like, that should
That's
have
like,
gone to her
wow,
first.
Right.
So yeah, no, to your point. I want to circle back to the question I asked about how you, as a curator of your own archive, not only with your books, but also with Left of Black, who's and with your Twitter feed, very intentional in all that you do. How would you envision someone consuming this book?
It is a book written for the digital moment. I remember when I did Soul Babies, which I would argue is an early gesture towards what this is, and having conversations with the folks at the Routledge about how do we create an audio version of it, right? Do we include a CD, right? All this kind of stuff that, you know, because streaming didn't exist yet, now we can just produce playlists.
Right, but I do want to say, I mean, the Norton Anthology of African American Literature, that first edition, it had a CD. Yeah.
And that became a whole question of, well, how do you clear the music and all that? Right. It became too expensive of an endeavor to actually bring about. We're now in this streaming moment. And one of the things that I did when the book first came out, I commissioned 2 mixes. One by the great Lene Denise, DJ Lene Denise, who did a mix based on the 2nd chapter. And then Brother Kwame, who I asked to do a mix of the 5th chapter. Because I wanted their critical reactions sonically to the text. So for me, that kind of dynamic is really interesting, right? It's a book that you read with Google and YouTube, right at your fingertips, because it's a book that I was able to write. Right. This is a book I couldn't have written 10 years ago. Right. Because the digital archive wasn't what it was 10 years ago. Right. And, you know, sometimes you have in your mind when you want to drop a new book. Right. Right. Okay. Looking for Leroy's out. I want this next one out in 2 years. Yeah. And the thing that's fundamentally different with me about this book, and I would argue as part of my maturation as a scholar and a writer, I had to learn that the books dictate to me what they are.
Yes. Yes.
And not the other way around. It was a thing that I learned with New Black Man and Looking for Leroy, which at some point was the same book. Okay. And the 2 siblings kind of fought it out. Yes. Yes. Like, you know, we're not the same thing, right? And New Black Man was like, I'm gonna roll out first. Right. Right. And then we'll let it gestate for a while, and then Looking for Leroy will make its appearance in the world. Yeah. And I had to wait for the book and the technology to allow me to write the book. Yeah. That I wanted to write with it. why it's important to me, there's a riff at the end where I mentioned the work of Conrad Kent Rivers. And to talk about archives, when I was a teenager in high school going to college, I remember trekking down to Liberation Bookstore, you know, a gem of a cultural, you know, thing in the black community that we don't have anymore. Bookstores for one, and that one in particular. And I bought a copy of this collection of poems edited by Dudley Randall called Black Poets. Carried that thing around with me in my bag every day for 6 years. At some point, I actually had to, you know, order a replacement on Amazon about 10 years ago. One of the poems is one by Conrad Kent Rivers. I can't even remember the name of the poem. And he was one of those generations of black writers who spent some time abroad in France. And at the end of the poem, right, because the poem is talking about why it was important to write black poetry. And one of the last lines of the poem, he goes, you know, because some black kid is bound to reach it. And that has always stayed for me. Whatever the work is, you put it out there.
Right.
Right. It might not matter in this moment. Right. But someone will find it at another point in time, and it will matter to them. And we do the work for that very reason.
Well, thank you for doing the work all these years. Thank you so much. We're going to open it up to questions at the moment. There's so much more in this book, I want to say. I didn't get to the chapter on stacks. I didn't get to the chapter on maroons and Wakanda. Janelle, there's one on Wakanda. And the different kingdoms in Wakanda. That is fascinating. So I do want to emphasize, I know this book came out last year. It is so deeply rich. No conversation about the cover of the book and why you chose it.
Norman Lewis, yes.
I mean, just...
And I got to tell one story about that.
Please.
I made up my mind that, because I got introduced to Norman Lewis about 15 years ago. And, you know, he has a very famous painting that shows up on all these kind of history collections. It's like, okay, what's this Norman Lewis guy, right? And, you know, my oldest daughter studied art history. And what I found is that in order for me to connect with both my daughters, I kind of had to travel them in their space. So I started paying attention to visual art in ways that I hadn't before because of her. And so I found, you know, I started to really get interested in abstract painters, right? And I write, right, in that 5th chapter, I write about all these kind of folks. And thank you to Margot Crawford, and I got to shout out Margot Crawford and Shauna Redmond in a second. So I just love this Norman Lewis stuff. So I remember telling my editor, Eric Zinner, I want Norman Lewis on the cover.
Yes, yes.
So he did what they do, right?
Yes.
And again, one of the reasons why I love working at NYU, and Routledge was fine, right, especially at the beginning of my career, but I always loved the NYU covers.
Yes.
They were amazing, right? And Eric, you know, who's my editor, we just had that kind of connection. So he found affordable, you know, Norman Lewis paintings, and we found this one, which is like called Street Music, or Street Musicians.
Street Musicians,
right?
Yeah.
And it was perfect.
Yeah, no, it is. It is a gorgeous book. So I'm going to hold this up. I'm going to ask for questions.
And I love the fact that they reproduced a version of the painting without the cover art.
Yes.
In the back page, right?
Yes.
Again, to kind of double down on.
Yeah. No, it's a beautiful, beautiful text.
So a question coming, but first I can't resist mentioning that we are sitting pretty much directly above where Aretha Franklin performed at City College.
Oh, wow.
In 1971, so maybe the same.
Probably around the same time, yeah. Wow.
So my question is I'm reading the book because Vanessa assigned it to me. and the subtitle is about crisis, and so I'm wondering, you know, exactly what the crisis is. I heard you say it's, you know, this is about the digital moment.
Yeah.
And I listened to 13 minutes of Isaac Hayes doing Walk On By, which I just got on my phone. So, you know, that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. The crisis is that we're not training or encouraging people to engage the archive. Right, the archive is treated as expendable, as literal, ephemera, you know, hence the title of the book. And it means that, for me, more broadly, it's a crisis of cultural criticism, right? It's a crisis of music journalism, right? It's a crisis of cultural journalism across the board, because we have people writing about black culture who have no depth of knowledge about black culture, right? In the contemporary moment in a broad sense, but also historically. When I started writing public-facing work, and shout out to the great online site Pop Matters, which launched in 1999 and was like a revelation to so many of us, right? We didn't get paid to do anything, but we had a forum to write about stuff. And this is before streaming, so I can remember, record companies would send them all of these CDs of stuff that's unreleased, right? They'd ask us, what do you want to review? We get a package with 10 CDs, usually a month before the albums came out. So you got to spend a month listening to stuff, right? You could hear stuff, and then you could go pull stuff in the archive to make that connection. Folks aren't writing on that way anymore, right? Because it's all about let's get it out there. For me, it creates a crisis, right? And the challenge of it is to write through what's not going to be read. Right? Some of this stuff is not going to get the kinds of eyeballs that other stuff is, but that doesn't mean that you don't do it, because it's going to go in somebody's archive. The practice of Left of Black, for instance, thank God went out in our 13th season. You've been on the show twice.
I have been.
We realized very early in the first season that we wanted an evergreen project. Right? We weren't going to do topical things. Right? Occasionally we might do something, but we didn't want to put on tape, digital, right, capture anything that would be irrelevant when the news cycle changed. So that's part of the reason why it's always been grounded in books, right? Because people should be going back to books over and over again, grounded in academic books as opposed to trade books, which themselves feel a little like ephemera these days, with the idea that, whatever we put out there now, someone will find value in 10 years later, right? And the fact that I still hear folks go, I came across this episode that you did in season 3, right, that I used for my class. The challenge is to build upon an archive that is sustainable, right? And partnering with the people that we need to partner with in terms of resources to be able to maintain those things. The choice that I made, because the conversations come up often, have you thought about doing stuff with NPR and yada, yada, yada? And the fact that my alignment with Duke University and their relationship to it has been sketchy sometimes, because they didn't know what the hell it was. I mean, we started Left of Black before anybody knew what a podcast was. Right. And had it launched 3 years later, it would have been a podcast. Right. For us, the video aspect of it, and shout out, to, Catherine Angst, who was the first producer, she instinctively understood the archival part of it, right? So we'd be in these conversations with folks, and she would edit this archival material in, right? And so we're telling people, no, you need to watch it, right? You need to watch it for the archival aspects of it, not just in terms of what you're hearing. But for me, it was important because then I could have editorial control over what I wanted to talk about, who I wanted to talk about, in ways that might be a different relationship, like with American Public Media or NPR or something along those lines.
And again, I mean, as someone who I do not take for granted that I've been on your show twice, a number of people across this country reach out to me and know my work because of Left of Black, particularly my work on Arturo Schomburg and Diasporic Blackness. I mean, that interview is, I'm working on a project now where the person wanted to learn more about my book and then went to Left of Black, Googled me, and it comes up. And so I say, as an author who has been on that show, that we understand the power of the medium, but also the power of you giving us a platform for those conversations.
And I got to shout out again, being here in New York, the late, great Gil Noble. The public affairs, though, that he did Like It Is when I was a kid, when I was in college. You know, the first visuals I've ever saw of Malcolm X talking,
Right.
right, were, you know, Like It Is, right? The amazing conversation he does with Bob Marley, 79-ish, right? You know, for American audience who had never seen that, you know, his archive, right? That's an archive I want to get a hold of, right there. There needs to be a book written about the archive that Gil Noble produced, created in a moment of crisis here in New York, and them running around. We need to create a Black public affairs program. Gil Noble, why don't you do it? And him just going, I'm gonna run with this
Right.
and do what the hell I want to do,
Right.
right? Especially in those days when it was an hour long,
Right.
until you tell me I can't anymore,
Right.
right? And when I'm done, I'm going to have this amazing archive
Yes.
of conversations that no one else was interested in.
Right. 4 years ago, we honored Gil Noble here at City College. So lots of things happening here at City College.
That's all I see.
Other questions, Janelle?
Yeah, I have a lot. I mean, I love the conversation on Black male interiority that I think is possible because of the work of 90s hip hop artists and that intersection of R&B and then making a choice of, I'm not going to be a singer, but I want to be able to talk about love.
Right.
And I think that it's an interesting response, perhaps even to the hyper commercialization of the early 2000s that, you know, had the jiggy drug kingpin kind of perspective, and like, where do you go from there? You know, like, if we're not going to do revolution, what else can we talk about? And I
Right.
think hip hop does allow, once Black men figured out it could do that, that it created a space for them
Absolutely.
to be soul singers of sorts. And I honestly think that Mos Def was a transformative figure in creating that linkage there. But I'm interested in thinking about how we archive, particularly hip-hop music and soul, since so much of it was off the record.
Yeah.
There is a deep culture of, like, you had to be there in the moment. If you're not down with the crew, you weren't in the studio, you didn't get to hear the freestyle that happened in the parking lot or the basement or whatever. So I know some record labels, like the guys down in Atlanta, I can't think of the Dungeon.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Dungeon Family.
You know, have, you know, released their own film, like Wu-Tang sort of
Right.
garbage time. But like, how do you think we can actually inspire people to collect all of, because there's so much material just in that genre itself of hip hop, like between the 80s and the 90s, that's, a lot of these folks are dead, dying, you know, very transient, like did not have, you know, the resources, so.
We have to encourage people to do that work. And you know, part of it, for me at least, has been a sacrifice. Because I could have written other kinds of books. And in fact, I'm working right now on a trade book on Black fatherhood that I'm sure both my agent and my editor wish had been done 2 years ago. But I had to do this first. Right? I felt a larger commitment to the culture, if you will, to do that kind of work. And so we have to encourage people, as we're always thinking about what forward is, that we can't go forward unless we cultivate the past. There's never been, still not, and I'm hoping someone gets to it before I have to, a real critical assessment of R&B music in the 1980s. Right? That shift from the analog sound of soul music to the Jam and Lewis's and the L.A. Reids and Babyfaces and what they're doing with drum machines. Right? That changes the sound of the music. What do we do with labels like Solar with Dick Griffey, or the stuff that at Taboo, right? That was the space, you know, when Motown and Philly International, Atlantic, these major corporations that had made so much money and generated so much black music, were no longer invested in that, right? It was these little labels like Taboo and Solar that gave us the Whispers, right? And Babyface and Karen White and all these kinds of folks, right? So that kind of critical work. The critical work of the 1990s, right? You know, R&B broadly, but also the neo soul movement, right? Have we really actually had the kind of conversations we need to have about who and what Erykah Badu was, who and what D'Angelo was, who Sade is now across multiple generations, right? Doing it on her own terms. I'm going to drop an album when I'm ready to drop an album. No one's going to dictate to me what that cycle is, right? Prince's practice, right, is I'm just going to record when I'm going to record, and now he had to push back against an industry that didn't know what to do with the wealth of Prince's music, right? Because it was too much for them to curate in a way that was financially beneficial to them. Prince's motivation is you curate it all because it's a gift to the culture, right? And the culture is more important than the bottom line. So yeah, absolutely, right? Folks have to go out to do that work, right? And it's complicated, right? Because I think, you know, and I'm gonna be honest here, right? Anybody can do this work, all right? If it's great work, it's great work. In the best case scenario, I'd like to see young black scholars doing this work because there's such a larger history of white journalists and authors having access to these authors, to these artists, right? Because they were connected to these larger institutions. You write for Rolling Stone, right? Right. This is going to be, you know, on a trade book, right? Where if you were a black journalist writing for Ebony or Essence or the LA Black Paper or the Chicago Defender, or, you know, the Black Baltimore, you know, it's like, I'm not going to give you as much time, right? Because I don't know where this is going to go. The digital moment has been great in this moment because now we have the archives.
Right.
And at a time when the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times was not interested in talking to black artists, right? It's like the same thing we saw in terms of television. You could come to perform, right? But you're not going to sit on the couch to have an argument, a conversation with. I love Dick Gregory, right? When Dick Gregory first gets invited to Tonight Show, he's like, I'm not doing it unless you allow me to sit on the couch to talk with you like you do all the white people. The beauty of Arsenio Hall, right? Arsenio Hall was the first late night talk show who allowed hip hop artists, right? So KRS-One could perform, but then you got to listen to KRS-One be KRS-One, wherever that might go.
Right.
You know, for 15 minutes, right? You got the Spike Lee to be Spike Lee. And so I think we need to bring back that kind of love of the culture and encourage younger black thinkers and scholars to really take this stuff seriously, right? To go back, not just create the newness, but to go back to this archive that still needs to be curated and caretaken for.
So hold the thought. I'm gonna shout that the person who asked that question got her MFA from here at City Colleges and in process of, you know, is currently a PhD candidate in English at the Graduate Center. And so she herself is one of these young up and coming thinkers who's deeply involved in the archive and music and just put on a fabulous conference last year about DJing and craft and all of the things. So Miss Janelle Poe, I just want to say that on record. So. Norval.
So that adds another thing. I'm sorry. So I'm waging a war against seeing the college experience as simply a college preparation experience and trying to get more people to think of doing things like Janelle Poe is doing. Thank you for allowing me to think about certain things a little bit differently. One thing that pops into my mind is Ava DuVernay's first film, This Is the Life. Maybe my favorite documentary. I watched it many times. I've shown it here to students because I know that I will always get the reaction, I never heard of these people before. You know, and this is exactly, I think, what you're talking about. I also appreciate your very first story about layering Tom Scott on top of the Boondocks, on top of your favorite hip hop song. every conversation of consequence I seem to have, or anything that I think of writing down that I think might be consequential, I get distracted by all these hits of reference that I want to include. But I think that you already answered. I was going to ask a question about it. I think you already answered it. You just put it down and let it go wherever wants to go. And the last thing is, I'm not sure I've ever heard the term blackness as labor. I'm sure I've heard it before, but then it made me think of Cheryl Harris's whiteness as problem.
Right.
So, oh my goodness, there's something there to go look at also.
There's a book, and I referenced it a few times in Black Ephemera. The late, great Clyde Woods did a book for Verso, going back now 20 years, called Development Arrested. And it is really the best book that has been written on the extraction of black culture and how it directly correlated to a capitalist process that begins. It's a book about blues music, right? And he's not separating the extraction of black labor in the fields from the extraction of the production of blues music. At the same time, centering black music, black blues music, as a primary narrative text in Black America, right? It's the both and. I said to, the audience yesterday at CAA, there's a way in which blackness is always entertainment for some audiences. It's always been more than that for black audiences, right? It is a conduit to black experience, to black vision, to black hope. Unfortunately, I think we're now dealing with a generation of young black folks who don't have that relationship to black culture, right? As it has become commoditized in the way that it has, and is as interchangeable as everything else that they consume.
Right. Yeah. Yes, sir?
Well, first of all, thank you for coming. I've looked at your podcast many times.
Thank you.
Helped me start my podcast.
Thank you.
And I'm an educator, and a lot of things you said, like you said, I'm just processing all of it, but I'm loving it because I'm from the hip hop in Jersey. I'm 44, so I grew up when, with rest in peace, True Boy, De La, all those people. I grew up with that, but also coming from a family that my mom had Ebony Jet magazine in the crib all day, every day. And having those references, when I throw out references, I have an older brother, so he introduced me to a lot of artists. So I had him kind of like my personal archivist. And then my dad saying, "Oh, well, let me get this record out the attic and let me show you."
Right.
So I'm taking that into the classroom with my youth and saying, "Hey, well, you like this? Well, here's the sample."
Right.
"Oh no, I thought that was a Drake song." "No, it's a Drake song."
Right.
But like you said, Marvin's Room is a reference to this. Check this out. And it makes me think of like a lot of what you're talking about, like with access. Not, you always said absent access, but not the servers, not the space. And I want to. It's kind of like a question, but then also like a statement. Is space the way we see space because it seems limitless, supposedly limitless through the digital context, that we don't regard it as sacred? And also how that relates to digital, like how we see digital, because like you said, it's like ephemeral. It's like, okay, well, I have as much space as I want, so I just throw this out on TikTok and whatever. Whereas before it was kind of felt limited, so we regarded it more sacredly. And like you said, taking the time, let it stew. And that's what I talk to my students. You mentioned a great point, that just because you're first doesn't make it valid.
Right.
Like let it, as I say, let it
Marinate.
Let it marinate, and that goes back to, again, that space, creating that space. And I just want you to talk more about that if you have more insight, because I'm trying to make that connection with my youth, and I feel like I'm a bridge from the younger to the older generation. So,
an artist might drop a new recording, right? In some ways, I still refer to them as albums or CDs, right? I don't know what you call them in a streaming moment, but it'll have 24 songs, right? It's like, let's just put everything on it. And, coming from an earlier analog moment where space was finite, right? An album might cover 40 minutes, right? Most albums actually came in shorter than that, right? You go to those Great Isaac Hayes albums, right? 2 15-minute songs on each side, right? Right. And in that finite moment, right, you had to make hard choices, right? You had to put quality, right? Especially when the album came a thing, right? The album for a long time in pop music was about filler, right? You know, we want to be able to collect all the hits and then we're just going to throw all this other stuff in it. But when the album became a thing, 67, 68, right? You know, largely because of groups like the Grateful Dead and folks like that. And folks started treating albums the way jazz artists treated albums. You had to make hard choices, right? The quality of it was enhanced because of those hard choices. Stuff's not curated that way anymore, right? You know, you want to put your album out, but then you got like 10 other songs with guests. You know, you couldn't do that back in the day, right? Because you didn't have enough space, right? Even when you got the CD technology only took 80 minutes, right? So even as it was a little bit more expansive, right? Digital now means that this stuff can go on and on and on, and it's not curated very well. The other part of it is that young folks are bombarded with more information and data than any generation that's ever lived. We have not equipped them with the blinders.
I call them
Right.
filters.
Right. To know good from bad. What they respond to is what makes them feel good. And sometimes what makes them feel good is stuff that's bad. Knowing that there's always something else coming. Right? There's always something. And I think blackness has always functioned from the standpoint that we can't take for granted what else is coming. Right? What I put here has to be the representation of the best that I'm capable of, because there's no guarantee I'm going to get another opportunity to do that. Right? And I take my lesson from that from Looking for Leroy. One of the chapters in Looking for Leroy is on the series, is on Avery Brooks and the series Hawk. You know, which was a spinoff of Spencer for Hire, Robert Ulrich, you know, based on those novels from Robert Parker, detective novel. Hawk was Spencer's black enforcer. And Avery Brooks took on the role as the enforcer in the television series. They're like, let's do a spinoff. We don't know what the hell, I mean, literally, they were like, we don't know what the hell this is. And Avery Brooks was like, this isn't going to last. They're going to give me 13 episodes. I'm going to pack as much as possible in these 13 episodes. So he's doing all this black mythology. He's talking about the salons that black writers maintained in D.C. in the 1920s. You know, do a storyline about saving the house and restoring the house. You know, he's referencing black theologians. I mean, it's just so much in these, right? And he's very clear, right? This isn't going to last, right? But that was a different kind of moment, right? Now it's like, well, you know, I'm going to do this streaming series for Netflix. And if it don't work, I'll do another one for Hulu.
Right.
Don't work out, maybe I'll get a Disney. And so there's like, and you just think about your own watching and streaming stuff. You can't keep up with all the stuff that's produced, right? And because we don't now have a critical establishment, right? And I won't even say in terms of the mainstream, what does the black critical establishment look like now, right? Where are the newspapers and the journals and the online sites that are producing the next generation of Joan Morgans and Danielle Smiths and Daphne Brooks and Greg Tates and Nelson Georges, right? Where are they writing where you could go to one place? I mean, that was the beauty of The Source in the early days.
Source and Vibe.
Right, especially when Vibe launched, right? You know, I can still remember Greg Tate's essay in the launch of Vibe magazine, right? Right.
Yeah.
The early days, you know, before Africana became the root.
Right.
There was a moment at Africana.com in the early 2000s where writers on the roster, myself, Bomani Jones, the dean of Columbia Law School, Jelani Cobb. We were all doing pieces for $600. All right. And so we don't have a space like that anymore, right? If we do have a space, it pivots towards celebrity culture, right? It's, you know, and this the thing that drives me crazy amongst the black digital press. Half of that work are riffs off of articles that were written by more mainstream pieces. Right. So if the Times does a piece on Dionne Warwick, right, there will be a version of that piece that references Dionne Warwick, right, as the story itself is not Dionne Warwick, but that the New York Times is the story on Dionne Warwick. And that drives me crazy because if you're not producing original content for your audience, what they need you for? Right? Why I need to read that in the Root if I could just go read it in the New York Times?
Right.
So yeah, it's frustrating.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Once again, I want to thank you all for coming this morning into afternoon.
And I got to give one other shout out about the book.
Yeah.
This year, this April will mark the 10th anniversary of Richard Eiton's death. And Richard and I were friends for a long time. We met at a Howard Cruz conference at Michigan. Right? They were doing an anniversary piece on the crisis of the Negro intellectual. I was up and coming, he was up and coming. We became fast friends over music. We probably, in the spirit of Ralph Ellison, and oh Jesus, what is his friend? And it's amazing because I just saw a picture of him. But we exchanged probably 1,000 email between 1998 and 2013. Everything from I just got these new CDs, et cetera, et cetera. Richard died just as Looking for Leroy was being published, and he was my most generous reader in that I would send him chapters from books. Every one of my books, from Soul Babies up to Looking for Leroy, and he would offer commentary. And it was in a memorial for Richard a year later that I met Shauna Redmond and Margot Crawford. And you know, we started having conversations, and they were my guidepost for Black Ephemera, right? And so it was like that was Richard's gift to me, right, to provide me with another set of generous readers, right? You know, that came together on the occasion of us, you know, memorializing him.
Well, thank you again for reminding us that no work is an individual effort. That in fact, again, the thought partners, the people that you can riff with, that you can just, you know, just exchange, just share.
And thank you for this.
Thank you. I got an email, I got a message saying I'm coming through. And I was like, we would be very happy to have you here. So thank you again for all of your work, for your years of work, both what we get to witness in your production, in your texts, in Left of Black, and your students at Duke University who have been, you know, you've been at Duke now for years.
19 years, yeah.
They are at the front lines of seeing your genius every single day. So thank you for all you do.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.